Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
If you remember back in 2003, MTV had a show called The Newlyweds. If you remember, if you're into those sorts of shows, and I have to admit, I'm not really into those shows, but my wife and her friends are, and so you kind of get, you're spending time with your wife, you're getting sucked into watching those shows. Maybe sucked in is not the best word. But anyhow, not too concerned. My wife doesn't listen to my podcasts or my LinkedIn lives anyways. But Jessica Simpson married a gentleman by the name of Nick Lachey, and they were pop stars and got married, and so MTV had this show called The Newlyweds, and every week would kind of follow their not antics, but their honeymoon, if you will. They were certainly in the honeymoon phase, and it was always very interesting to me, or comical, because they were kind of giving advice to people who were married. And my wife at that time had been married about 9 years. They're giving us advice, and it's like, man, you guys have been married like 9 weeks, 9 days. We got 9 years. At this point, we have 3 kids. I don't want to hear advice from you. And that was kind of what tuned me out from it. But nevertheless, the show didn't last. Their marriage didn't last. But kind of underscored the point that every relationship has a honeymoon phase, and eventually that honeymoon phase ends. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I think that life would be very boring if we all agreed on everything, if we always all got along. And there was never any tension between people. We just get out of sync. You might have had a great night's sleep and I didn't. And, something might matter greatly to you and doesn't really matter to me. And so I'm not approaching things how you want me to approach things. But if we all got along and there was no, we all got along and there was no disagreements, there would be no innovation of thought. We would just, we wouldn't have Zoom. We wouldn't have StreamYard. We wouldn't have LinkedIn. We wouldn't have lots of things because we just, we're constantly challenging. We're constantly exploring. We're constantly, kind of moving along. Now, if you think about just the average relationship, well, I should say not the average relationship, but, non-marital relationships, professional relationships, they start pretty much like regular relationships start. I met my wife. It was small talk. Met her. We just had a small talk conversation, and it went from there. And most relationships start with small talk, and everything kind of seems great. It starts on that high note. I remember when I started working at the firm that the one and only job I ever had, the firm I was at, which is now PricewaterhouseCoopers, going in on that first day. It was September 1st. It was a Thursday. It was a great day. You're starting your first job. This is awesome. I'm actually getting a real paycheck, and met the bosses and met lots of people, and everything was wonderful. And I remember because it was a Thursday, and it was September 1st. It was the Thursday. Obviously, then the next day is Friday. But the following Monday was Labor Day, and it was really kind of a busy time in the tax consulting world, or the tax world, because corporate tax returns are due on September 15th. So everybody was kind of really busy. And essentially, we were there for a half a day. It was me and 2 other people that were starting. And they said, listen, you don't need to show up on Friday. There's no work on Monday. I'm like, this is great. I put a half a day in. I get 4 days off. Everybody is so nice. But as I indicated, every relationship has a honeymoon phase, and eventually that honeymoon phase ends. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that when we start relationships tend to start really kind of on a high note. And then we settle in, and things, I don't want to say things change, but we're not totally in sync. When that relationship's starting, everybody knows, okay, on your best behavior, best foot forward. Um, you know, kind of mind your P's and Q's and what you're saying and what you're revealing and so on and so forth. But as time goes on, you can't do that. You eventually have to be genuine. You should be genuine from the start, but the things about you are going to come out. And then you'll find that opinions vary and stakes are high. And emotions can be charged depending upon what the situation is. And while every relationship starts with small talk, eventually what intervenes is what I like to call big talk. And that's where we have to have these hard conversations. We have to have conversations with subordinates. We have to have conversations with colleagues. We have to have conversations with our boss about lots of things, how work's happening, conversations with our vendors. It goes on and on. And these things can be contentious depending upon where people's mindsets are at. We don't all always agree on things. Things are going to go sideways. We have misunderstandings. And while small talk is nice, we need to be able to manage the big talk conversations as well. So what I want to do is I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about these big talk conversations, because in reality, our brains are hardwired not to be very good at these things. They're just not. There are lots of parts to the brain, but let me break it down into two simple parts for this conversation. There is a part of our brain that's primitive, and it's super fast, the amygdala. It's just super fast. It just reacts. And that was born in a time when we had really to make one of two decisions when we were faced with a threat. And that was fight or fight or flight. Stand there and fight or flee. And oftentimes when we get into contentious situations, we feel that threat and we feel the amygdala kicking in. It is super fast. It's lightning fast, and it's just going to react. And people will fight. You might say something to somebody, and then they just bark right back at you. They've chosen to fight, and that's their way of fighting. When I say fight, I don't mean necessarily in the physical sense, although at times I'm sure that has happened. But when I mean fight, you've said something, you've crossed them. Stakes are high. Their opinion is different on something, and they're just going to bark back at you, or maybe you're the one barking back at them. And I think, I've been on both sides. I'm not perfect. I'm sure everybody here will admit to in a quiet moment to themselves. But that's the amygdala hard at work, and that's fighting. And the fleeing part is just being quiet. Somebody says something you don't agree with, you just kind of shut up. And know that neither of those are good, the fight or flight. But there's another part of our brain, which is a newer part of the brain, the neocortex. And the neocortex is much slower. It's logical. It allows me to talk. It allows you to understand what it is that I'm saying. And it allows us to sort through the notion that, okay, my boss has said something to me, or somebody has said something to me, it's threatening, but it's really not life threatening. Whereas the amygdala might pick it up and say, okay, this is threatening. This is physically threatening. You need to defend yourself, or you need to flee. And the neocortex allows us to kind of rationalize things. Okay, you know what? My boss has said there's going to be layoffs. Doesn't mean me. Or my boss has said, geez, your hours are down, productivity's down, or I don't like the work that you produced on this particular project. And the neocortex allows us to say, okay, doesn't like it in this particular project, but there were other projects that he did like. And so it's not necessarily a death sentence that my boss doesn't like this particular thing I did. The problem with the neocortex is that it's much slower. The amygdala has already reacted, if you will. It's kind of like the difference between lightning and thunder. You see lightning because the speed of light is so much faster than the speed of sound. You see a crack of lightning off in the distance, and it might be several seconds before you hear the sound. Well, that's the amygdala versus the neocortex. The amygdala it's just gone. It's done something. whereas the neocortex just takes a little longer to react, if you will. Now, the interesting thing about these two things is these two parts of the brain is they can't be operating simultaneously. If your neocortex is operating, your amygdala is not. And if you're in that fight or flight situation, you're not thinking, right? I mean, you've seen people just, well, maybe it's you. I know it's been me, where you're just kind of reacting, and you're not thinking things through. And when you have a quiet moment later on, you realize, oh man, I can't believe I did that. You know, I can't believe it. I can't believe that happened. It's, you know, people tell you get a grip. That's what getting a grip is. Getting a grip means, hey, just quiet your amygdala and focus in on what your neocortex is saying. So these two things can't be operating at the same time. So the challenge when things are tense is to enable yourself to engage the slow brain, the neocortex, which will calm the amygdala. And so what I have learned, well, what many people have done for eons, before we really understood what was going on, take a deep breath, count to 10, right? It's pretty simple. You take a deep breath, you count to 10, and that just allows you to get the neocortex operating. And when the neocortex is operating and you're kind of thinking, okay, what did my boss just say? What did my coworker just say? What did the vendor say? What did, colleagues say? And you can kind of sort it out and then, engage that higher order of thinking. It's slower, but it's a higher order of thinking. And once you're engaged in that and have that engaged, the neocortex isn't going to kick in. So certainly counting to 10 or 25, depending upon the situation. But there's another what I find to be a more useful approach to this, to taking on big talk. And I found this in the book Crucial Conversation. Great book if you get an opportunity to read it. I think it has 4 different authors, so it's hard for me to remember who all the authors are. But in Crucial Conversation, what they encourage you to do, and again, to engage that neocortex, is to stop when you're in one of these situations where where tensions are high. Opinions might vary. It's probably emotionally charged. Is to stop and answer these questions, and you might have the benefit of knowing that you're going into these situations and being able to answer these questions ahead of time. And a lot of times that's the situation. You're going in for an employment review, or you're going to meet with a client who's not happy with something, or whatever it might be. You kind of know that it's coming. And so you can kind of quell your amygdala by just addressing these simple questions. What do you want? What do you want from the situation is the first question. Okay, I'm having a falling out with this particular person, or a potential falling out with this particular person. Well, what do I want? Well, I don't want I don't want to fight. I don't want us being toe to toe calling names at one another and just having it escalated into a verbal arms race. So just, what do I want? You kind of think it through. And then the second thing you reason through, and you don't have to necessarily do it in this order. What do you want for them? For me, I deal with franchisees. I deal with hundreds of members in AmSpirit Business Connections. What do I want for them? Well, I want a degree of success. I want them to be happy. And I can think through those things in my mind, and we might have a disagreement as to what those things are, or how to get to those things. But we're sort of in agreement on that general premise that we just want one another to be successful. So you think that through and have that conversation, certainly with yourself in your head. And then the last thing you need to answer is, what do you want for the relationship? How do you want this to continue on? Do you want it to be a verbal arms race where you're just kind of seething behind the scenes about somebody? The answer is no. And you can think through in your mind how you want things to go, how you want the conversation to be a win-win. What does that look like? And it's hard to come up with examples because there are just so many different types of examples out there. But if you want to quell, when you get into these situations, these big talk situations, think through those particular questions. And that will engage the neocortex, which is the higher order of thinking, and it'll calm you down. And by you being calmer, the situation will be calmer. And if the other person's not calm, you can always just say, hey, let's just take a time out, and maybe pose those questions to them and give them an opportunity to engage their neocortex. There's nothing wrong with doing those things. Small talk is great, but eventually you're going to get into these big talk situations, and you need to be ready with a way of handling those particular conversations.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.